If you do have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, thank you. Right, please welcome for the first time Pippa King with Biometrics in Schools. Government's almost without consultation with parents introduced biometrics and RFID into schools for our safety, probably after a reread of Orwell's 1984. Pippa, a part-time self-employed teacher, objected to these intrusions on privacy after her children were almost fingerprinted for access to a library. Further than this, Pippa ferociously lobbied MPs, and now schools must obtain written parental consent before processing children's data in this way. So, one woman can make a difference. Please welcome Pippa King.
Good evening, thank you for having me, and thank you, Rob, for that. This is a brand new up-to-date talk with some information on that's really only sort of come about in the past 2 weeks or so, so it's smack bang up-to-date information. So I'll talk about my journey and really since 2005, the past 10 years, of what I've been trying to do is trying to get schools not to use fingerprint technology, but I couldn't achieve that. But we got the law passed through Parliament so that now parents need to know and there's consent. Then I'll talk about how RFID, radio frequency identification, is being used in some schools, and also how the Internet of Things is also being trialled in schools. So the UK schools seem to be a test bed for technology. And then sort of on from that, my interest in biometrics has sort of taken me to look at the wider picture and how biometrics are used in society with adults, and how you don't know about it yet. So just to sort of clarify, I mean, when I teach piano for a living, and I didn't know what fingerprint biometrics were 10 years ago, and I had to educate myself. And so basically, schools would say to parents and kids, if they told the parents, it's not a fingerprint that we're taking, it's a number string, it's an algorithm, which is much like the one on the end there. So when you biometrically scan a fingerprint, it picks up the salient points and the whoops and swirls on the fingerprint, and it plots a little map and then makes that into a number string. So you can have fingerprint biometrics, which are really common in schools. Schools also trialled infrared palm scanning biometrics, so this works on the same sort of principle, where it looks at the veins in the palm of your hand and makes a little map and plots a picture. This was trialled in a primary school in Scotland for children to get their lunches, and it was never before had been done anywhere else in the world, as far as I know, in schools. This is iris scanning. Apparently, the biometric data you can get from an iris scan is just about nearly as accurate as DNA, so that your iris really has a very accurate picture of who you are, because they're so unique. And again, different salient points are plotted on the iris, made into a number string. Oops. So this is, I think, one of the most insidious forms of biometrics, because it's facial recognition, facial detection. And this can happen to you and to your children without you knowing about it. For example, in some shopping centres in London, they have biometric scanners that will scan you as you walk in, identify if you're a female or a male, white, other ethnic group, and how old you are. And it will. They have advertising boards that show you an advert they think you might want to see. So, for example, Tesco's, I think, have something called Amscreen, which is from the old Amstrad, Lord Sugar's corporation. And they, as you walk up to the petrol kiosk to pay your petrol bill, there'll be a screen, and that will show adverts at you. Now, that screen is actually a camera in itself, and as you're standing there paying your bill, it's looking at you and assessing who or what it thinks you are, and will show you the appropriate advert. So I now don't buy at Tesco's, but I went to another garage and I saw an Amscreen in there, and so now I don't shop there either, because I don't want to be facially scanned. I mean, they're not identifying who I am, but they're taking my data, and I don't appreciate that. This is an artist who made a mask so he could wear, so he could stop this sort of intrusion going. And the mask sort of covers the various parts of the face that the points are making up to make the map and the data. This is also another way that you can this is also another way that you can fool facial scanners by painting your face. If you see people walking around like this, they might know something you don't know if there's a facial recognition system going on. So we had facial recognition that was trialled in schools in the UK over the past 10 years. We've had iris scanning, we've had infrared palm scanning, fingerprints, and this has largely gone without anybody knowing about it. Can I just ask how many people here were aware that schools were using fingerprints? So,
only because you told me.
so that's probably about a third of you. So how many people have got children in secondary schools or primary schools? Yeah. Well, if you could do with asking your children if they've got fingerprint scanners in there, because the vast majority of secondary schools have now, and they should be asking for your permission, and don't have to give it. So this is voice scanning. It picks up sort of a behavioural component to how you talk, and the data is using a spectrogram like this, so that this is how banks can confirm who you are. Some banks are starting to use voice biometrics over the telephone, so that then when you instruct them to do something, obviously they know it's you. This is another type of biometric that I think is being trialled at an Israeli airport. This is from April 2014, and it's skeletal biometrics. So the biometric scanner is looking at how you walk, and if it determines that you're not walking as a normal person should walk, then it will flag you as a person of interest. And I don't know quite how that works or how successful it is, but that's certainly being trialled. The same sort of technology, or a similar sort of technology, was being trialled at Brisbane Airport. So this is using what you call soft biometrics, so it's not identifying you as a person. So you've got facial recognition, which recognises you and says, that's Pippa King, or this is somebody else. Facial detection or soft biometrics will pick up what your face looks like and then tracks that face around the system. But it also can pick up on items of clothing, hats, the way that you walk, the skeletal biometrics like that, so gait biometrics. And all this is happening probably in places, if you've been to an airport recently, that you didn't know about. This is an interesting type of biometric, and this is what some military departments use, and it's called cognitive fingerprints. So it recognises how you type, much like speech and voice biometrics recognise how you speak, with pauses in your speech and how your accent is. Apparently this is the same on a keyboard, so everybody has individual ways of typing on a keyboard with pauses and stops and different weights on different keys. And these cognitive fingerprints can be used to identify who's on a keyboard. I know they've been looking at doing this in the States in the education system to check that people doing their homework are the people that are meant to be doing their homework, and it's not a friend or a mum or a sister or something like that, just to check it is the person. So, going on to biometrics in schools. My kids were nearly fingerprinted in 2004 when they were 6 and 7 years old for a library system. And I thought that was just wrong. I didn't get asked. I happened to be in the school and I saw a credit card size fingerprint scanner in the library. And it had only been maybe even 2 or 3 weeks earlier that I'd been on the internet and found an article talking about using these fingerprint scanners in schools, and I just thought, that's absolutely ridiculous, that'll never catch on. And next thing I know, there's one in my son's primary school. And so I said to the head teacher, I was probably the only parent in the school, probably the only parent in Hull that knew what this fingerprint scanner looked like and that they were doing this in schools in the UK. And I just said, when are you going to ask my permission to take my son's fingerprints? Because I'm not going to give it. And she just looked me squarely in the face and said, I don't need your permission to take your son's fingerprints. And I thought, that's got to be wrong. I mean, I have to sign, if you're a parent, you have to sign for food, medical, school trips, if they need to walk across the road to go to the swimming pool. But yet, they could take my son's fingerprints and not tell me about it. I just thought that's wrong. So I ended up, pardon me, going back, finding the article that I saw on the fingerprinting in schools, and getting in touch with the organisation who'd put the article up, which was a small organisation called Action on Rights to Children. And I gave them a ring, and I explained what had happened with the school. And she said, oh, the school's absolutely right, she doesn't have to take your fingerprints. And I said, well, that's just got to be wrong. And she explained to me it's because We have a Data Protection Act, and under that Data Protection Act, if the school wants to process any of this particular data about my children, they have to have my permission. It's called sensitive personal data. And as you can see, biometrics isn't on there. So schools are well within the law to take kids' fingerprints, iris scans, infrared palm scans, process them, and not tell parents they were doing it because it didn't fall into this part of the Act. So I immediately thought, right, well, the Data Protection Act's got to change. I never, ever got involved with politics particularly, least alone trying to change a law. But I just thought this was just so wrong for me as a parent. One of the reasons why I thought it was wrong was because, you know, my children were 6 and 7, and at that age, I should take part in their parenting, not the school. The school shouldn't be deciding what's good for them and what's not. That's my job to advise them, especially when it's such personal data. And also I was really concerned about them getting the message that it was okay for them to give up their fingerprints in order to read a book, which it just isn't. That's not how life works. And I think it sends a real subtle message to children when you say to them, right, we'll only feed you, we'll only give you knowledge, and we'll only let you in certain parts of the school if you give us your fingerprints. Because we don't operate in a society like that. And certainly if somebody said to me, well, I'm only going to feed you if you give me a fingerprint, it would be unrepeatable what I'd say to them, because that's not how it works. You know, we use money, or we use PIN numbers or swipe cards. They don't need to take that level of information off a 6-year-old child to get a library book out of the system. And I was also concerned about where and how secure that data would be and who would be seeing it. So this is how it started way back in 2001. There was a company called Microlibrarians, and they thought it might be a good idea if, in order to speed up the massive queues you get in school libraries for kids wanting to take books out, that there would be a fingerprint system in place. So they went to the Information Commissioner's office, which is the ICO on the left there. The Information Commissioner oversees the Data Protection Act. So they basically wanted to check to see if they were allowed to do this within the limits of the Data Protection Act. And that particular letter there was a letter sort of saying, yes, you can, we can't see that there's any problems. In fact, it's the text at the bottom. It says, however, from what I understood of our discussions, although theoretically possible to use the information obtained in the system to match fingerprints taken from the scene of a crime, this resource would require, the resources this would require makes this highly impractical. That was way back in 2001. 10 years later down the line, that is not true. Fingerprints can travel from a school database to a police database, and they can be identified and used if they think it's going to help solve a crime, but we'll come to that later. So this is a guy called Kim Cameron, who used to work at Microsoft. He doesn't now. And basically Britain was the only country globally to be doing this, and it had come to his attention. And he was basically spitting blood about it. I could have given you 10 quotes from him all about how bad fingerprinting children in schools were. But essentially, these people were manufacturing systems or looking at making systems of fingerprint scanners for the security industry and for the banking industry. So when you've got thousands of school children's fingerprints on unsecure databases, it's sort of, and they could get compromised in the next 10 or 20 years, the technology that they were looking at sort of developing wouldn't be relevant because the fingerprints would be compromised already. But this is really important. It had said, I'd not understood that fingerprint templates, the number string, were a reliable unique identifier, reusable across databases and even across template schemes without a fresh biometric sample. So he's saying that once you put a fingerprint on a fingerprint scanner and it goes on that database, it can be transferred not only to other databases as the same, but also completely different databases. So basically the reason why that's able to happen is because in the States, states had different sort of laws, and so when somebody had committed a crime and went over the state boundary, the state they'd gone from couldn't access the other state's information, the fingerprint information. So they developed systems about 20 years ago so that fingerprint databases could talk to each other in the United States, and that's exactly what we've got here in the UK. You can put a fingerprint potentially on a school database and it gets transferred onto the police national database. I have no evidence of that happening yet, but there's a possibility it might have done. So we started to look. Terry, who runs Action on Rights for Children, who the original article had come from, had said to me, We've got a number of parents, about 5 parents from the whole of the UK that have been concerned about this, and she said, would you want to sort of coordinate a little parent working group, and we'll see if we can, communicate with MPs to get a change in the law. So I said, yeah, okay. And so as we sort of went down that sort of process from 2005, 2007, 8, other parents are starting to ring in with some real horrible stories about how their children were being treated if they weren't going to be fingerprinted. So, for example, there was a school, Morley High School in Leeds. The headmaster there had basically said, right, if you're not going to get fingerprinted, you don't agree with it, you'll have to bring in your own packed lunch, and you'll have to sit outside and eat it. You're not allowed in the canteen, or change schools if you don't like it. There was in Chester, there were some pupils that were not fed because they weren't fingerprinted. In London, we had pupils that were made to go and eat last. They were the ones that weren't allowed to sort of go and get their food first. And again, in Chester, one child was so upset and distressed about it, partly because I think children are quite well educated now, especially on topics like this. And she asked to go and phone her mum from the school office, and the school actually told her that they'd already contacted her mum, and her mum said it was okay, which was a complete lie. It's outrageous. It almost seems odd that they were so eager to get these systems in place. But so through to 2001 to 2011, there were probably about 4 or 5 questions asked just prior to 2005, before we as a group of parents got involved. And then we sort of found sympathetic MPs and got them to ask some questions in Parliament. When we were going to Parliament and trying to get a change in the law, in my eyes, biometric technology doesn't have any place in schools whatsoever. A child's biometrics needs to be secure for the next 60, 70 years. You're going to trial biometric technology on any section of the population, and this came from other parents that we were sort of working with. And I have to say, quite a lot of, at least half the parents that came on board were parents from the tech industry, because they could see how dangerous it was to use this relatively immature technology with children. One of the guys, Andy, was sort of saying, why don't we test it on OAP bus passes? Because at least if their biometrics are compromised, then really it hasn't got a lifelong consequence for them. So yes, we found some sympathetic MPs, and we had questions asked and some debates and external Downing Street petitions and an early day motion put forward by Greg Mulholland MP in Leeds. But it was interesting because Labour, who were in power then, wouldn't talk to us at all. When we asked them how many schools are fingerprinting kids, how many kids have got their fingerprints on a fingerprint database, they had no clue. They just said, well, as long as schools operate within the law, it's nothing to do with us what they do with fingerprints. And that was their attitude right the way down the line. And Conservative Schools Minister Nick Gibb and Sarah Tether, as was the education opposition MP with Lib Dems, they met us on a number of occasions, and they asked questions, written questions, and they got exactly the same answer from the Labour Education Department. And they basically said to us, sort of coming up to 2009, they said, look, if we get into government in 2010, we'll do something about it. Which they did. Surprisingly enough, it actually worked. So obviously we all know there was a coalition in 2010, and in 2011 the Protection of Freedoms Bill was drafted, and this was basically, it was called a Christmas tree by everybody really sort of in the privacy industry, because it had bits of legislation sort of written into it, so that the Conservatives and Lib Dems thought it sort of needed sort of addressing after 10 years of Labour. And in the particular chapter 2, we got our little bit about fingerprinting in schools. So in those clauses 26 to 28, it's the only legislation that applies on a national level globally to using children's biometrics in schools. And it applies to everybody that's under 18, so it's not just up to 16, it's up to 18. And it's really specific in the fact that each parent of the child has to be notified that the school wants to process their fingerprints or iris scans, facial recognition, even if they're split up. And if one parent agrees and the other parent doesn't agree, the person not consenting overrides the consent. And if both parents agree and the child doesn't want their biometrics taken, then the child's non-consent overrides the parent's consent. So it's really weighted heavily in the non-consent area, which we were really pleased about. But it was interesting watching the debate go through Parliament, because I I advised the Bill Committee, along with Terry, I'm not sure on rights of children, and it was interesting because I've never seen legislation sort of work before, and so yeah, we advised the committee, and the bill sort of flip-flopped a little bit between the two houses and followed the debate in the Lords and then back to the Commons again, and it really, once it was drafted initially, that essentially didn't change at all. The Lords, one member of the House of Lords was quite keen to see the consent come down to 16, and the other Lords decided no, 18 was the sort of age. So this got passed in May 2012, went for royal assent. But then it doesn't become enacted, which means the schools have to abide by it until September 2013. So it gave them 15 months of sort of adjusting or gaining consent. So I sort of had a bit of time off after that because I've been at this since 2005, so that was quite good.